The conflict and contradictions of a dual heritage nation when dialogue stops centers on the tension between the Mexican state's pursuit of national unity and economic globalization, and the demands of indigenous communities for autonomy and recognition of their cultural and political rights. While the Mexican Constitution promotes equality, the reality of indigenous groups, especially in regions like Chiapas, has been systemic marginalization and exclusion. The 1994 Zapatista uprising exposed these deep inequalities, particularly in terms of land rights, economic opportunities, and cultural recognition. The government's initial response to criminalize the movement evolved into the San Andres Accords of 1996, which promised autonomy and self governance for indigenous groups. However, these promises have largely remained unfulfilled, as the government has failed to implement the agreements, leading to continued frustration and the establishment of autonomous indigenous territories like the Zapatistas. At the core of the conflict is the question of whether a modern state can truly integrate cultural diversity while maintaining a climate of equality and equity. Indigenous communities argue that true equality requires recognition of their unique cultural practices and the freedom to govern their own affairs. They seek not informed treatment under a single legal system, but the ability to practice self determination within their own legal and social frameworks. The Mexican states hesitance to fully embrace these demands highlights the challenge of balancing national unity with the rights of culturally distinct groups. Thus, the conflict revolves around whether the state's liberal principles can coexist with the recognition of ethnic and cultural diversity and whether equality can be achieved without sacrificing cultural autonomy.
To ensure the integration of cultural diversity and create a real climate of equality and equity, the Mexican state acknowledges that there are certain groups, such as indigenous communities, that are marginalized, instead of hiding this fact in the name of upkeeping equality. The fact that the law differentiates between different types of Mexicans does not mean that inequality is created or exacerbated, but merely that already existing inequalities are reduced. By empowering these marginalized indigenous communities to freely practice their cultural values, by giving them the freedom to self-determine and self-govern. Equality does not have to mean that everyone has to live according to the same values, but that freedom exists for all communities to determine their own values. Governmental policies can achieve this, but have to be created in respectful and equal communication with a diverse range of these communities' members. This is why the San Andres Larindar Agreement is an important step forward in the achievement of these goals. This agreement recognizes indigenous communities as a separate group in the Constitution, and with it, grants them the right to self-determination and autonomy, a right to determine their political representation and participation, a guarantee to full access to the legal systems, and a recognition of indigenous normative systems within these legal systems. Next to this, it promotes indigenous cultural manifestations and traditional knowledge, and increases employment
The
opportunities.
EZLN calls for economic autonomy, where indigenous communities can manage their resources and practice self-governance, also stating that modern governments should be multi-ethnic in order to include and strengthen themes such as diversity, inclusion, and non-discrimination among all indigenous people and population along the country. The Zapatistas emphasize that economic policies like NAFTA prioritize corporate interests over indigenous people's rights, and that these policies led to the exploitation of indigenous lands and resources. At the same time, the constant discrimination and exploitation of these rights of the indigenous people and their cultural patrimony, like their lands or their traditions, have been also a crucial factor that has extended the fight and protest claiming for liberty, democracy, independence, health, among other unrecognized rights. Although the San Andres Accords of 1996 promised the recognition of indigenous rights and autonomy, the answer of the government was in the form of military operation of the territory of Chiapas, in which the rights and treaties made in 1996 are yet to be applied. In response to this, the Zapatistas have created and installed their own territories called caracoles, in which the articles presented in the San Andres Accords are applied even without the recognition of the Mexican government, in which they build societies where through social labor and effort an autogovernance system has been created surrounding the needs and rights of the indigenous population of Chiapas. While the recognition of this treaty of 1996, almost 30 years later, are yet to be recognized and applied by the Mexican government.
To ensure the integration of cultural diversity and a real climate of equality and equity, the United Nations calls for the full implementation of international agreements like the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A modern state must not only recognize the rights of indigenous communities but also integrate their governance structures into the national framework. So Mexico's San Andres Accords were a step forward, acknowledging indigenous self-governance, yet their incomplete implementation has kept inequalities in place. So the United Nations emphasizes that indigenous communities, like the Zapatistas, should manage their own affairs and resources, as their demand for autonomy is essential to dismantling systemic oppression. The Mexican state's argument that empowering indigenous groups reduces inequality aligns with this, as it acknowledges that equality doesn't mean uniformity, but freedom for all communities to determine their own paths. However, as the Zapatistas stress, real autonomy has yet to be achieved, and economic policies must prioritize marginalized groups. So, a modern state must engage in ongoing dialogue, respect indigenous self determination, and fully enforce agreements like the San Andres Accords. This will foster an inclusive society where cultural diversity and equality are truly integrated.
What was seen in this case is a clear violation of the right and indigenous groups' right to self-determination. In as established in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which Amnesty International has supported and still supports, modern states should, first of all, enter equal dialogue with indigenous groups, allow indigenous groups to self-determine, respect the group's right to self-governance, and respect the right of a group to hold their local government, culture, education, and economic action. Another example, apart from the one of the EZLN, that has been seen is the one that happened in Canada during the 19th and 20th century, during which almost 100,000 indigenous children were forced into Indian residential schools, as they were called, where they were forced to abandon all traces of their native culture. The children in these places suffer extreme abuse, and many of them died in these schools, then with their bodies being hidden in mass graves that are still being found today underneath the schools. As in order to avoid this type of situations, it expected that the government and the modern state should enter equal and just negotiation and dialogue with indigenous groups in order to achieve a positive outcome in which the rights of these indigenous groups will be respected and they will suffer no further harm to the culture or their people by the hands of the government. And at the same time, do it in a way that will allow the government to um, that will be agreeable to the government of the state.
So for the solution, the first one is to implement and fully implement the San Andreas Agreement. Although they already agreed to it, the government, they didn't act on it. And if they agree to it, they would give indigenous communities control over their own economic system and political system. Also, another solution is decentralizing economic power and give indigenous regions a source to manage their resources and also benefit from their resources. Also, there should be a cooperation between the state and indigenous leaders. And also, there should be an international oversight. Mexico already signed the ILO 169, which says that they would support indigenous people and communities. And why we came to that solution is because there are already uprisings and people are already unhappy. And the uprising of Zapatista shows that if people don't get recognized, they will force people to recognize them, and it's better that the government takes an active role and not just let things play out like they are. Then also 7 out of 10 indigenous people live in extreme poverty, and although the government argues that if they give too much autonomy, there's a risk of dividing, it's also a chance to take ownership of the history of Mexico, and that indigenous people been marginalized for such a long time. It would actually help heal the Mexican people and show unity and show ownership of their history.